Over 500,000 people go missing in the US every year on average. What would you do if it was someone that you knew, someone that you cared about? Drop everything and try to find them? Report it to the police? In big metropolitan areas, missing persons are reported frequently. What if police don't even take it seriously? That is the position that Teresa Martin and her daughters found themselves in the morning of September 9th, 2017, when Kenneka Jenkins, their daughter and sister, went missing. Hello, my name is Lachey, and welcome to Unmasking True Crime Misdeeds, a show where we look back on tragic moments in true crime to paint the scene in a different light. We try to remember that these people were more than just characters in storybooks. They were victims of unforgivably heinous acts. Today, we are looking at the case of Kenneka Jenkins, a young lady who planned on having a normal night out with friends at a hotel party, and how all of that took a turn for the absolute worst. So first off, hotel parties. I just remember back in the day, it was something that I went to, a few of them, right? Some of them get out of control and maybe you don't want to go back. But I do remember just having those kind of get-togethers in your late teens, in your early 20s with different friend groups, because at the time, a lot of people didn't really necessarily have a tribe yet. And so essentially you're going to a party with your friends and you're meeting up with other people who may not be your friends. So it's really interesting that this case gets murky at this party.
Yeah, I definitely loved hotel parties back in the day because nobody has their own space. And the houses you go to where people have their own space, generally those get really out of hand because it usually means the adult in the house doesn't care. Hotel parties were a little different, but you're right, you make a really good point about there's a lot of people that show up to these parties that you may not know and who may not know how to act.
Right.
But for me, what really stands out as I think about this introduction in this case is that they say the first 72 hours are crucial. If you listen to any police shows, if you listen to like the authorities as they discuss cases, the first 72 hours are crucial.
Right.
And yet they make you wait 24 hours to report somebody missing.
Exactly.
You know, what I found though is it's not that they're saying that in the first 24 hours that victims are being found or that they're returning home. So that just makes me go, if they're not coming home within the first 24 hours, most come home within the first 72 hours. So then why are we waiting 24 hours?
Right. It's a best practice that probably needs to go away.
Yeah, especially in the age of technology.
Partying in your teens and 20s is pretty common. So when 19-year-old Kenneka Jenkins asked her mother, Teresa Martin, to borrow her car on September 8th to go to a party with some friends, Miss Martin didn't think anything of it. She had no problem with giving her car for the night. Her mother likely told her to drive safely and have fun, like most parents would. Kenneka left around 11:30 p.m. and made her way to the Crown Plaza O'Hare Hotel, where the friends were having their party. A few hours later, Kenneka arrived at the hotel. According to friends of hers who were there, Kenneka had been drinking alcohol and showed signs of intoxication. They said she also seemed to be down and was not acting like her usual self. The teens eventually got bored at the party and decided to leave. Kenneka waited in the hallway while her friends went back to the room to retrieve her phone and other items. When they came back, she was nowhere to be found. They searched for her and eventually left the hotel to check if Kenneka's mother's car was still there. It was, and now they began to get worried. They called Kenneka's mother, Teresa Martin, and let her know what was going on. Within about an hour, Miss Martin was at the hotel trying to find her daughter. At this point, it was very early in the morning on the 9th. She began to talk to hotel staff trying to get somewhere in this frantic search, but to no avail. Staff informed Miss Martin that they wouldn't be able to release CCTV footage to her without a missing persons report filled out for Kenneka. In big metropolitan areas like Chicago, missing persons reports and cases are handled by a specific unit within a given department. These areas also see much higher rates of missing persons than their suburban and rural counterparts. Miss Martin contacted the local department to report Kenneka missing so that progress could be made. However, the department suggested that she wait a little longer. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, most people in Kenneka's age range turn up on their own. The department figured that Kenneka would show up and be fine, so Miss Martin waited. Kenneka's sister, Leonore, got involved after heeding the advice of police and waiting. Around noon, she began to call and report Kenneka missing again. And about 30 minutes later, the police would pass along word to the hotel staff. Miss Martin and Leonore were beginning to get fed up with the lengthiness of this process and perceived lack of urgency on the part of the police. They decided to take matters into their own hands. Later that day, they went back to the hotel. Working their way from floor to floor, the two ladies went door to door asking hotel guests if they'd seen Kenneka and if they knew anything that might help find her. Hotel staff called 911 on them for disturbing guests, but it seems that nothing came of this. At 10 o'clock, almost 24 hours since she initially went missing, a break came. Camera footage reviewed by police showed Kenneka's movements that night. It showed her stumbling through the halls and eventually making her way to a kitchen at around 3:15 a.m. In the footage, she was alone. She is last seen walking towards the freezer, though there is no footage showing her walking in. 2 hours later, half an hour after midnight, an employee stumbles upon a body in the freezer lying face down. It is Kenneka Jenkins, found nearly 24 hours after her friends last saw her. Her sister had spoken to her on the phone less than a day ago, and now she was gone.
Okay, so there's a lot of information here. And I think the first thing that I really want to call out is kudos to this friend group. I think about being in my late teens, my early 20s, you're hanging out, you're partying, you come back downstairs and your friend's not there. This friend group knew that Kenneka was not the type to just disappear. They immediately knew something was wrong. And I think that speaks volumes when it comes to the urgency and the reporting and the difference of how a situation should be handled.
Right.
Has this person ever disappeared before? Yes, no, okay, let's take this seriously.
Right, they thought that it was suspicious and they acted on it immediately, which was great that they did so. And even though there were other delays, they did what they were supposed to do for their friend.
Right, and that expedited this a little bit too, because imagine if they didn't say anything to her mother for 24 hours the next morning.
Exactly.
And, to see her stumble in on video into this kitchen, what would your first thought be if you see somebody stumble into the kitchen if you're working security at this hotel?
Exactly, and that was the issue with the footage because they didn't have a camera that was placed directly on the freezer, but they had cameras which were facing the hallways and leading into the kitchen, and she was seen stumbling, and it was for a while. So you would have seen someone stumbling through the halls of the entire hotel, down through an elevator, into a kitchen, right? So the question is, who was monitoring the cameras? And if they weren't monitoring the cameras, what happened? Why was there that loss of control? About a month after Miss Martin and Kenneka's sisters received the worst news one can get about a missing loved one, the coroner's office released a statement that Kenneka's passing was accidental. Her BAC was .11, according to the report, and an anti-migraine medication was also found in her system. Both alcohol consumption and the medication found can cause hypothermia to set in quicker than normal, and that was the verdict of the autopsy: accidental hypothermia. However, the police were going to leave the case open. No foul play was suspected, but they wanted to leave the door open to any possibilities. And kind of going into the medication that she was on. So it was said in her toxicology report that she had alcohol, and she also had an anti-seizure medication. The mix of those two together causes disorientation. So as we've reviewed the case, we do know that she kind of stumbled into this kitchen area.
I have an issue with this. Why is this case being left open if no foul play is suspected? If this is a closed case, it was an accident, is what the police have said, why is the case being left open?
There were quite a few theories as to what happened that night. Gang involvement in her disappearance was one of them. The credit card was reportedly linked to a Chicago gang, according to multiple different sources. Some believe that this pointed to said gang having some sort of hand in what happened that night. Police disputed those claims as lacking factual evidence to back them. While some groups thought up theories for circumstances about her passing, others simply protested to a lack of care on the part of the police and the hotel. The largest demographic of missing persons in the Chicago area at the time was young black women, and the public seemed to agree that this lack of urgency in locating Kenneka was not an exception, but the perceived standard for missing persons cases involved in this demographic. A California senator was quoted as saying, "When you only make up 13% of the population, but almost 40% of the individuals who come up missing on a regular basis, but you rarely see any media attention on that or any type of law enforcement resources committed to that, it required this measure." In regards to a program instilled in California government to highlight black missing persons cases during an interview with NPR. Protests were held outside the hotel where she was found for weeks afterward. Her funeral also garnered over 1,000 attendees to pay respect. In Chicago, it's in Cook County, and black women make up 12% of the population, and within that, they are 30% of the missing women's cases, which is very disproportionate when we're looking at the rest of the population. And there's a lot of factors that go into that, especially socioeconomical factors. But there's also the response time with the police and how they handle investigations, and if they dismiss these calls for reported missing women. And is that response different based on the people group that's reaching out?
Yeah, that is a big disparity. Can you imagine being 12% of the population, but 30% of the missing women? I can't. And you mentioned a really good thing. I think a lot of socioeconomic factors come into play in how police respond, and I don't know that it's always a conscious decision.
Right.
I think there's a lot of unconscious biases out there, which is why we see a lot of major corporations and state entities taking their employees through unconscious bias trainings.
Right.
And making sure that we are not letting our predetermined thoughts and experiences impact how we're addressing situations.
Mm-hmm. What would ensue over the course of the next several years was a lengthy and likely stressful legal battle to do justice for Kenneka and her family. It started in 2018 when Miss Martin and her legal team filed a lawsuit for $50 million against the hotel security company, and the restaurant that the hotel claimed they had been leasing out the kitchen to. There were several reasons for the suit. Miss Martin believed that the hotel and the entities operating within all of its exemplified gross negligence in their duties and daily procedures that resulted in the death of her daughter. The hotel staff had no excuse to wait as long as they did to look at camera footage. There were also arguments that a staff member potentially unknowingly locked the freezer while Kenneka was inside, but that claim was disputed after investigations showed that the door to the freezer where she was found had no locking mechanism. Regardless, Miss Martin was steadfast in her beliefs. She still had issues with the lackluster effort to locate her daughter. There was also the issue of no one spotting Kenneka on the cameras in real time. While we covered that there were no cameras that could directly see the freezer where she was found, there were cameras that spotted her in the kitchen, an area that was very likely meant to be off limits to hotel guests. However, no one spotted her, and at least no one reported spotting her. On top of any issues with camera monitoring, there were more very sound arguments that Miss Martin and her legal team were making. For one, why was the kitchen so accessible to hotel guests? How did she end up getting into it in the first place? And there was even a door with a lock on it leading to the kitchen, but that night it was unlocked and open for some reason. Another example of poor operating procedures leading to the potential for unsafe conditions for hotel guests. Another argument was that the hotel made no proven effort to prevent the party from taking place. This argument is a little less documented than others, but some sources allude to the party being a vessel for underage drinking being brought to the attention of hotel staff, but management took no action and did not follow up on the information.
So I think about all the things that we've heard today, and I I really think about, even in the most attentive and speediest of positions, and how this case could have been handled differently, would the outcome have been different? When you think about a commercial freezer, they're usually kept at about 0 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, most people, an average size human, would freeze to death in a couple of hours. And would a more attentive police response have led to a different outcome? We've heard some things on how this case was handled, and the timeliness of the initial report. And, to see her stumble in on video into this kitchen, what would your first thought be if you see somebody stumble into the kitchen if you're working security at this hotel?
Exactly, and that was the issue with the footage, because they didn't have a camera that was placed directly on the freezer, but they had cameras which were facing the hallways and leading into the kitchen, and she was seen stumbling, and it was for a while. So you would have seen someone stumbling through the halls of the entire hotel, down through an elevator, into a kitchen, right? So the question is, who was monitoring the cameras? And if they weren't monitoring the cameras, what happened? Why was there that loss of control? 6 years after Kenneka's passing and 5 after the lawsuit was filed, Kenneka's family finally received justice. In December of 2023, just days before the lawsuit was set to go to trial, a settlement was agreed upon. It was a $10 million settlement total. It was split up between multiple different parties. Miss Martin received $3.7 million. Two undisclosed family members, likely Kenneka's sisters, although that information isn't certain, received 1.5 and 1.2 million, and 3.5 million went towards attorney's fees, and $6,000 went towards funeral expenses for Kenneka. In the wake of the settlement, the hotel has not issued any public formal apologies and has not admitted any wrongdoing, and has said very little in general in regards to the responsibilities for the passing of Kenneka Jenkins. And with that brings us to the end of this tragic story thus far.
So the family brings this lawsuit forward, and I think there's merit here. You look at operationally all the misses. So you have a kitchen that has a lock, which means they recognize that it's an area that should be reserved for hotel staff.
Right.
The door's not locked. Kenneka is stumbling down a hallway. She's seen on video stumbling down a hallway and entering this kitchen. Not in real time, but after the fact she's seen. So there's another controllable miss. Nobody was watching the camera footage. And then, she gets into this kitchen. We learn that the freezer doesn't have a lock, which, I can't speak to. If it should, shouldn't. But I do know that commercial freezers aren't easy to open.
Right.
There's it's a heavy duty handle.
Right, and with her being disoriented, I doubt that she would have been able to open it anyway, and somehow she found herself inside of it. Right. And couldn't get back out either. So if it didn't have a locking mechanism, did it shut and seal itself? How does that make sense? I don't understand.
Yeah, I've got a lot of questions here, so I definitely think, I can understand why the family would come forward and question the hotel's responsibility in this. And, clearly the law was on their side. They didn't.
Right. Exactly, because it is a liability. And if we think about it, there was a restaurant that held the lease. However, this freezer was operable. But why was it operable if the restaurant actually wasn't in use?
Yeah, lots of questions. I think there's a lot of outstanding issues here, and obviously they're not outstanding because this legal case, this lawsuit was wrapped up, but I've got lots of questions.
Right. This one was definitely tough to swallow. A young woman, who some may even still call a kid, who was partying like many other people her age do, a series of what some may call unfortunate events, or what others would call negligence, leads to a very unfortunate passing, which then leads to several years of grieving, stressful legal battles, and more for the family left behind. On top of that, the implications that this has on the community as a whole, with a perceived lack of action on the parts of both the police and the hotel, is certainly a messy situation. Regardless, thank you for stopping by to learn about the case. And though the circumstances are grim, I'm glad you took the time to be here and learn about it. If you learned something or enjoyed this episode, make sure to like and subscribe and turn on the post notifications to get a heads up when the new episode is up. I'm Lachey, and I'm with my co host Marie. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.